You won't get away with it, Stanley said to Will that night. Moonlight came through the window. It was already well after lights out, and the two boys were in their beds, but neither of them could sleep, thinking about the plan Will had just described to Stanley. All through dinner, Will had pondered it. Davina kept interrupting his thoughts, of course, arguing with someone and asking for his opinion, or glancing at him and rolling her eyes. But his mind kept going back to the same track. Gradually, the plan had taken form. "How do you know I won't get away with it?" said Will. "How can you be sure?" "You just won't." Will sighed. Stanley wasn't necessarily the best source of advice. After all, he was more at home with robots than people, and he wasn't truly happy unless he had a control palette in his hand. And his best friend was a dog that he had programmed himself. But Will suspected that in this instance, Stanley might be right. "Well, I've got to do it," he said at last. "I've got to see what happens when we go under the helmet. Someone has to." "And I'm telling you, they'll find out," said Stanley. "Easily," muttered Bennett. Will looked at the shoe drawer. Bennett's white face was just visible in the shadow, peering back at him. "How will they find out?" said Will, looking back at Stanley. "They just will," replied Stanley. "I don't know how they will, but they will. It's too big a risk." "What do you think they'll do to me?" "That's obvious," said Stanley. "They'll kick you out," said Bennett. "See? Even Bennett knows." "Ruff!" "Is there anything about it in the rules?" asked Will. "It's tampering with the helmet, Will. Remember what Professor Gelmet said? Tampering with the helmet equals expulsion." "Expulsion!" growled Bennett, and from the way he said it, Will almost thought the dog was hoping it would happen. "They can't kick me out if it isn't written in the rules." "You can't eat me," said the Chihuahua to the Alsatian, announced Bennett cheerfully. "When?" "Just before he ate him." "Oh, all right, so they kick me out," said Will. "At least I'll know." "Know what?" asked Stanley. "Know what happens." "What if nothing happens?" "Then that's what I'll know." "Nothing," said Bennett. "Wait, that's what you know already, isn't it?" "Stanley, can you shut him up?" "Not without deprogramming him." "What are you waiting for?" Bennett growled. Suddenly he leapt out of the shoe drawer, landed on Will's bed, and licked at his face. "Get off me!" cried Will, flailing at Bennett with his arms. The dog danced merrily all over Will's pillow, licking him as he went. "Bennett, get off me!" shouted Will again, and he managed to get his hands around the dog and throw him off the bed. The dog landed with a crack. "Ow!" he cried. He dragged himself up on Stanley's bed. "He hurt me, master." "Let me see." Stanley checked him over. "It's all right, Ben. You've just lost a leg. That's easily fixed." Stanley got down on the floor and started feeling for the leg. Bennett whimpered and glared at Will. "See, what kind of a boy are you?" he demanded. "Hurting innocent puppies." "You're hardly a puppy," retorted Will. "And innocent? Huh. What am I then?" "Guilty." "Of what?" "Of talking. Of interfering. Of existing." "Am not," said the dog. So?" "Am not." So?" "Technically, Will," said Stanley, putting his head up over the edge of the bed. "Bennett may be right. I'm not sure that he does exist. As a living creature, I mean. He's a road dog, remember?" "See!" cried Bennett, and he jumped up on two of his 3 legs and began dancing around on Stanley's bed, singing, "Will's wrong, I don't exist, I don't exist, I don't exist, Will's wrong, I don't..." "Bennett," said Stanley, "be quiet. Someone will hear you." Stanley stopped. There was a noise in the corridor outside. "Bennett!" hissed Stanley, pointing to the shoe drawer. The dog leapt off Stanley's bed and into the drawer. Stanley, who had found the missing leg, tossed it in after him. They all listened. There was definitely someone in the corridor. Feet shuffled. Then the shuffling stopped. Very quietly, Stanley got into bed. Will lay perfectly still. Was that the door sliding open? A tiny way? A fraction? Was that a pair of eyes behind the door? Footsteps again, moving away. Silence. Will stared at the ceiling, listening for sounds. "Will," whispered Stanley. What? Whispered Will. Who was that? Did you see? No. Silence. Will! What? Are you really going to do it? I don't know, whispered Will. Yes, I think so. Maybe. Someone has to. Think about it carefully before you do anything. I will. Silence. Will! What? If you do it, will you tell me what you see? Yes. Even if they kick you out, will you tell me before you go? Yes. Thanks, Will. Good night. Good night, Stanley. Hello! Good night, Bennett, said Stanley. What about my leg? Go to sleep, Bennett. With 3 legs, demanded the dog. With 2 if you don't stop talking, whispered Will. Go to sleep, Bennett, whispered Stanley again. I'll fix you up tomorrow. The next morning at 9 o'clock, Will entered the studiarium with the other children. He lay back in his chair, as he did every morning, and waited for Dr. Fugg to reach him. She worked her way steadily up the line, placing the helmets on the children's heads and connecting them to the cables that came out of the floor. She reached Stanley first, and then Will. He smiled at her while she connected his helmet. Dr. Fugg replied with her usual even, steady gaze and moved on to Cynthia Singh in the next chair. After Cynthia, she moved on to Davina. Stanley glanced at Will with a questioning look in his eye. Will nodded. He turned back to watch Dr. Fugg. She moved from child to child briskly and efficiently. Now she was connecting Edmund Zucker's helmet. Benedict Goldberg was next. Will continued to watch. There weren't many more to go. Soon Dr. Fugg had reached Carlson Marks. After that she would be with Charlotte Reedy, and then she would be with Titania Morgan, the last in the line. And after that Dr. Fugg would activate the chair magnetisation and no one would be able to move. Will, whispered Stanley. He raised an eyebrow as if to ask what Will was waiting for, or perhaps to ask whether he had changed his mind. Will looked back at Dr. Fugg. She was placing the helmet on Titania's head. It was now or never. Will took a deep breath. He reached up, felt at the back of his helmet, found the place where the cable connected to it, and quickly pulled the cable out. He lowered the cable quietly to the floor beside him. Dr. Fugg finished connecting Titania's helmet. Ready, leaders? She said, fingering the pads on the control pallet. Will felt the magnetic force of the chair suck him back and lock him down. Happy learning. Will held his breath. He stared straight ahead. He didn't know what to expect. Suddenly, all around him he could hear rustling and shaking. He glanced to the side. He saw Stanley's arms and legs shaking, held down only by the magnetic force of his chair. On the other side, Cynthia Singh was shaking as well, and Davina was shaking in the chair beyond her. Everyone was shaking. Will closed his eyes and shook as well, trying to move as the others did. After about a minute, Will heard the shaking stop. He opened his eyes fractionally and moved them from side to side. The others were all lying still, except for occasional twitches and jerks. He caught sight of Dr. Fugg, still standing at the end of the line near Titania. He quickly closed his eyes. He heard Dr. Fugg's voice, softer, much softer than when she spoke to all the children. That's right, murmured Dr. Fugg. Learn. Sleep. Will peeked at her. Sleep. Learn, Dr. Fugg was saying. She was stopping at each chair and carefully looking at the face under the helmet, opening each eye and shining a torchlight into it, then moving on to the next chair, working her way closer and closer toward him. Thanks for joining us. Tune in tomorrow for another chapter of Will Buster and the Gelmet Helmet.